This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
stage. All right. It's too exciting. Okay. I won't say too many words. But Anne is one of our former grads. As she works at Urbis, currently a senior valuer, specialized in retail shopping centers, right? So one of the important sort of components for retail, for today's discussion, is actually a student program. So I won't, interrupt too much for the important component.
Thanks, Hal. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all well. Like Hal said, my name's Anne. I'm a senior valuer at Urbis. If you haven't heard of Urbis, we're a property consultancy firm that operates throughout most of Australia. We've got offices in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and also Western Australia. And also a few years ago, we opened up an office in Singapore as well. So we're sort of, I guess, in the process now of sort of moving more into sort of a multinational type firm. And we offer a range of property services. I guess overall we try to deliver, we try to collaborate across lots of different business units within our company. I work within our real estate advisory team, and that comprises of valuers and broader property consultants that also work in investment management. And then across the rest of our business, we've got an economic advisory team, we've got public policy, urban planning is probably our largest team of individuals, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney. And we've also got urban design, landscape architecture, and heritage. And we've also recently opened up an archaeology business in Sydney as well. So as you can see, we cover quite a wide range of, sectors sort of within the property sector. And it really helps us, I guess, when we're delivering projects to clients to really cater to all phases of the property cycle. So we sort of work from anything from the acquisition phase right through to disposal of an asset in various ways. Just thought I'd start today by letting you all know about our student internship program that we offer every year. We currently have applications open for this program, and it's a really great program and I cannot recommend it enough. I started off working at Urbis as a graduate just before this program was put together, and just seeing the way that it is being run, it's really great. We get to essentially pick a business unit that you would feel like you would be most suited to, and then within that business unit you get to sort of rotate through different teams within that sector. So if you were to come and work in real estate advisory, you get to work in retail shopping centres, so that's kind of where I spend most of my time and where I do most of my work. We also have a commercial and industrial team as well, and they do similar types of work, I guess, but sort of in that commercial industrial space. We've also got an investment management team as well that you get to rotate through, and that's a new part of our business that has sort of only been up and running now for about 12 months. On top of that as well, you get to work and get some experience with compensation and litigation valuation, and also statutory valuation. So I guess they sort of sit on the other side of the consultancy framework and is sort of less for, not necessarily just for owners, but can also be, I guess, for government projects and that sort of thing. So in terms of, I guess, the other offering, I guess you get to be part of, involved in like a social and networking level as well. So the students get an opportunity to run a project together. And that was something that sort of came into fruition this year. So all the students across all the different business units get a chance to work on a project together and really, I guess, present that back to the business and show what they've been able to come up with given a certain set of criteria. So I think the really great thing about the program is that you get the on-the-job experience working on projects with other consultants in the firm and directors in the firm, but then you also get the opportunity to sort of really collaborate with your peers and get to know one another as well. So I can't recommend it enough. Applications are currently open, so they opened on the 19th of August and you've got until the 13th of September to apply. We then have an information evening and interviews which sort of kick off over October. Part of that information evening you get to hear from a few guest speakers within Urbis, and they also tell you a little bit more about the program itself, and after that you get a chance to do a group sort of interview with the broader teams. The program itself runs from February to December next year, and it's on a part-time basis, but it's pretty flexible, and I think that's the other really good thing about this program is that you can sort of work the days that really suit you. And I don't want to point her out, but Mel was on our program last year. So did you have anything to add about it, Mel, from your experience?
It's a really good program that you get to gain a lot of experience, and it was really nice.
It's good, I'm glad to hear that. And I bet as well, it just, you know, there's just so much, I guess, to learn. I didn't get the chance to rotate through the teams like Mel did, so I've just always sort of been in retail. It's sort of been my specialisation. I guess in that regard, you're sort of more across all these other areas, so you can get more of an understanding about what you actually want to do sort of longer term in your career as well. Yes?
Is this program only for Australian citizens?
I'll have to check that for you. I think it is broadly offered. I know for the first year, so this is a one-year program. I think after that point in time, it becomes a bit more of a discussion. But I'm not 100% across all of the details, but I could easily find out for you. All the information should be on our website, but if it isn't, I'll ask how to circulate my email, and you can get in contact with me and I'll find out for you. So on to today's, I guess, lecture topic, which is all about retail shopping centres and valuation. I guess, could I just get a show of hands, just sort of who, I guess, has any experience working in either property consultancy or retail or from a property perspective or valuations or anything like that? So a few people? Okay. For today, I might go sort of take a step back and sort of look at things, I guess, and sort of build on it. So I'll start off sort of so that everybody's on the same page, looking at some really key things that we look at when we're valuing property. And then over the course of the lecture, I'll sort of delve into a little bit more of that finer detail for you. So the topics that we'll cover today are shopping centre typologies, the fundamentals of development, and then on to valuation methodology and financial analysis, and then also a little bit of an overview on some key retail trends and I guess current news that we look at frequently. Always important to stay on top of these things that pop up in Australia, particularly as it's become a more globalised country, I guess. I sort of grouped these categories so that you can sort of see, I guess, how we would work through a valuation or piece of advice for a client. So we'll start with, I guess, shopping centres in their most basic physical form, and then look at what's really important when you're developing a shopping centre. And I guess all of those things are then intrinsic to how we then choose to go about our valuation. So I thought I'd just start today's lecture by talking about the different types of shopping centres. And this sounds really basic, but it is actually really important to when you're valuing any type of property is to really understand, I guess, on this sort of more micro detail about what it is that you're valuing. You'll see here that shopping centres generally get grouped into different categories. So you've got super regional centres and regional centres. They're often grouped together. You've then got sub-regional centres and sort of down through neighbourhood centres, your local high street shops, CBD centres and large format retail centres. I'll just walk you through, I guess, what all of these terms mean and really what is involved, I guess, in each of these assets from a valuation perspective, but also in terms of what they're made up of, because they do vary quite significantly. So a regional shopping centre is defined as a major integrated retail centre under single management and is based either on having at least one department store or discount department store with a minimum of 10,000 square metres or 3 full-line discount department stores. And I'll get back to these definitions in a second about what a department store is versus what a discount department store is. But just so that we can cover up the definitions, I thought I'd just put these up there first. So essentially your regional centres, these are like your largest shopping centres. These are the ones that draw customers from, I guess, a broader catchment. So something like a Chadstone is a super regional shopping centre. And the reason that it's so important to really understand what type of shopping centre you, I guess, are looking at is because it will really be integral to your valuation, not just in terms of what metrics you apply from a cap rate or discount rate perspective, but also from how you look at growth in your discounted cash flow. So regional shopping centres typically have sort of more of that discretionary spend level tenants. So it's got your fashion retailers in it, and it's also got your sort of more leisure items like your jewellery, or it's probably got more focus on gyms and that sort of thing as well. I think also the other important thing to note about regional shopping centres is it's got less of that more non-discretionary items. So your everyday sort of food and beverage offering is less important in a regional centre, given why customers are choosing to come to your centre. It is partly that, but it's also sort of more for that broader shopping experience and ability to access essentially anything within the one property. So I guess in that regard, the regional shopping centres sort of have a more comprehensive coverage and a full range of retail needs. So they also include more specialist retailers that might be only seeking to sell one very particular item, but it also has those sort of larger scale tenants such as your full-line department stores, which catered more to, I guess, trying to have everything within their tenancy. And the aim of these centres really is to be complementary the tenants aim to be complementary to each other. And it becomes really important when you're looking at shopping centres to really understand how each of those tenancies actually affect and interact with one another. And you'll often find when you're walking around a shopping centre, particularly a large one like this, you'll notice that all the fashion is grouped together and then all the food is grouped together. And there is a reason for that. Tenants tend to perform better when they're located, surprisingly, when they're located close to their, I guess, immediate competition. And really that's because, you know, I think as humans we go, oh, I want to go and buy, I want to go buy some food. I'm going to particularly know that the food is all located in that one spot, and then you've got more of a choice. So I guess in that sense it's sort of like that cluster economic thing that occurs in shopping centres, which sometimes can be planned, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So historically, retail used to sort of cluster of its own accord. So you had your high streets in your suburbs that would generally sort of form over time, and you'd get different retailers clustering together. In shopping centres, it's more about managing your centre to really understand how should I be clustering tenants together and what should be involved in that process. And I'll delve into that a little bit more as well later. So I guess some key differences between your types of regional centres. You've got major regional centres and super regional centres. Super regional centres sort of sit at the top of the regional centre chain, and really they just have the most offering that you can possibly have within a shopping centre. Major regional centres sort of sit below that, and these ones tend to be a little bit smaller. They've generally only got one full-line department store, whereas your super regionals tend to have sort of two. This has probably got a David Jones and a Myer in it, whereas major regional centres probably only have a Myer or a David Jones. And then it's got, I guess, a full range of retail needs under that as well. So some examples, I guess, of your super regional centres, as I said before, include Chadstone, Eastland Shopping Centre, High Point, Northland, Doncaster and Fountain Gate. Whereas if you sort of go one level lower towards your major regional centres, you've got Water Gardens, Westfield Geelong, Dandenong Plaza and Pacific Epping. So they're sort of smaller, sort of less well-known centres unless you live in that particular area. I guess the other thing as well that we look at when we're looking at centres is, I guess, the types of owners that own these centres. So regional centres tend to be owned by your big sort of listed Australian real estate investment trusts, so your AREITs. So some examples of these that you've probably heard of is Vicinity Centres and Centre Group, who were formerly sort of known as Westfield. They still brand their centres as Westfield, but the actual entity is called Centre Group. You've also got GPT, and then also your sort of larger private equity firms as well, such as Blackstone, who you may have heard of. So they're the kinds of sort of owners of these large centres, and often these centres won't just be owned by the one entity, they'll be split, so they'll be owned by sort of anything between 2 to 4 sort of investors are really looking to invest in these types of centres. And it's very unlikely that you'll ever get one of these sell sort of 100% interest. It'll always usually be sort of in segments. So I guess another sort of level down from regional centres, you get your sub-regional centres. A sub-regional shopping centre is built around 1 or 2 major discount department stores, 1 or more supermarkets, and includes specialty shops. These centres really, sort of over time, have really changed in how they interact with customers. I think historically sub-regional centres were created because they were really trying to be, I guess, a point of differentiation between a regional centre and a neighbourhood centre, which is even smaller, was to have this sub-regional space, which really was to bring in, I guess, discount shopping for people that live in an area that want to do more than just buy food, but they don't want to have to go to a department store, so they want to go somewhere like a Big W or a Kmart or a Target. I guess what sort of happened over time is that people's shopping habits have essentially changed, and sub-regional centres have really sort of become less favourable assets in the market, and this has really been reflected in property transactions over the last sort of, within the last 12 months, but sort of before that as well, I guess within the last 1 to 3 years. So an actual definition, I guess, of one of these centres, you can either have 1 discount department store or you can have 2 discount department stores. So I've got 2 examples there. The first one is a well-known shopping centre in Burwood. The Kmart and the Coles there are both open 24 hours. And that's an example of a single DDS shopping centre. So it's just got the Kmart and then it's got a Coles and an Aldi. The one below that is also technically classified as a sub-regional centre. However, it's got 2 discount department stores, so it's got the BW and the Kmart. In terms of the positioning of these assets, really, I guess, the smaller one there at the top is probably an example of what has sort of managed to, I guess, survive the, the softer conditions of the last 12 months, because really that type of shopping centre there is sort of got less of that space associated with discount department stores, and really your risk is sort of less. I guess purchasers would look at that sort of with sort of more comfort and they wouldn't see as much risk in that, an example of that first centre compared to that second centre, where all of a sudden you've got two really big tenancies that are filled with brands that aren't performing particularly well in the current market. So moving on now, I guess, to neighbourhood centres. So these are the smallest shopping centres that we tend to deal with at Urbis. So these are your centres that are really just focused around a supermarket. And generally speaking, it'll be a full line supermarket. So what we mean by a full line supermarket is it's got the full offering that tenant can roll out. So like a Woolworths or a Coles. And they'll have sort of 3,000 to 4,000 square metres in space. So for a full line offering, it's sort of at that 4,000 square metre sort of area, and anything below that is sort of considered to be not quite a full line supermarket. These centres might also have a few specialty stores within it, but they'll generally have a significantly reduced offering compared to a regional centre or a sub-regional centre. So comparatively, you've probably only got sort of 10 to 30 of those smaller specialty tenancies within a neighbourhood shopping centre, compared to your sub-regional and regional centres where you've probably got hundreds. And these centres are really there to just sort of cater to that weekly spend for your groceries and the like. And really, investors really like these centres. I guess the reason is that they're sort of intrinsically part of our day-to-day, and a lot of the time we don't even really notice that they're there. We just sort of tend to go there and we go and do the shopping and then we go home, and that's sort of all we really think about it. But I guess that's the reason that investors really like it, is because they know that regardless of what is happening in the broader economic climate, people will still need to buy food at the end of the day, and they're still often going to overindulge potentially in times where they feel a little bit of a pinch, and they're probably going to spend less money in those times in those larger shopping centres. So these centres are typically located in regional areas, residential areas. So they really like to be close to people's houses, I guess, at the end of the day. And they service that immediate residential neighbourhood. These centres as well usually have shopping hours that are extended, so they usually go past sort of like your typical 5:30 p.m, 6 p.m, and sort of, might be open up to 24 hours a day. The supermarkets might be. Really, the specialty tenants, though, will still sort of tend to run that sort of 9 to 5:30 sort of p.m. kind of time frame. These are also typically located in growth areas. And I guess the one thing that's really interesting about shopping centres is that part of what's happened over time is that the planning framework has said we're going to build a new suburb over here, and as part of that framework you have to build and you have to create for your community a shopping centre. I'll get into that sort of more in a moment, but I guess what I wanted to allude to is that you can end up under the planning framework ending up with a lot of these centres. And what can happen is they can really start to compete with each other too much, and you can sort of find that you've got too many of these sort of smaller centres all clumped together as a result of the planning framework. So I guess it's just something to be really aware of if you're ever looking at or doing a project on a small centre like this. Always just be really careful about what other centres are around and why has that happened that there's so many in that one spot. It's usually a result of the planning framework, and what can happen is that your valuations essentially will come back a little bit on these types of assets because you've got too much competition going on, and investors can't essentially generate as much money out of those centres as they would like to because they've got too much competition going on in the background. In terms of the types of purchasers that are interested in these assets, generally it's sort of smaller scale syndicates. You've got your high net worth individuals that might like to buy something like this, particularly in the $10 to $30 million range. You've got smaller property trusts as well, such as the SCA Property Group, who are affiliated with the Woolworths brand. But then you also get fund managers such as ISPT that are also interested in these types of assets as well. I won't spend too long on this one, but this is sort of your CBD centre. An example of this would be something like St Collins Lane that I've got up on the screen, or Emporium in the city. These types of assets are quite interesting. I think particularly as Australian cities really start to become more globalised, these centres will continue to do well. Emporium, since it was developed, has done exceedingly well beyond, I guess, anyone's expectations. I guess the reason for that now is that we've just got more and more development going on in the inner city, and more people want to live in the city now than what we sort of saw historically. These centres have sort of gone from your smaller types of arcades to sort of these bigger, fuller scale city centres. And usually they're still owned by one entity. These as well, I guess, cater to a slightly different market as well, because you've got your residents living in the area, but then you've also got your office workers as well. So they're generally catered sort of more around food and services compared to some of your other centres. Emporium's probably the exception though, because it's got a lot of apparel. And this is sort of what I alluded to before. These are sort of your more traditional shopping centres that I guess we wouldn't even really think of as a shopping centre. But, I mean, back before the 1960s, I mean, this is where you went to do all your shopping. And these differ quite significantly, I guess, because you've got, rather than everything being under one ownership, it's a whole lot of different people often that own each of these different premises. I guess it will be interesting to see what happens with these types of retail precincts across, particularly across Melbourne, sort of over the next few years. To date, I guess it's been quite mixed in terms of their performance. So, I guess the well-known ones such as Lygon Street, Burke Road in Camberwell, Glenferrie Road in Hawthorn, or in Malvern, and then you've also got Puffle Street in Moonee Ponds. All of those shopping strips have performed very differently over time compared to one another. And it's really been the shopping strips that have had lots of residential development going on around them, and a lot of consolidation of sites into higher density residential that have really actually managed to sort of stand the test of time a little bit. I don't know if any of you have noticed, if you're sort of driving around, that you might see a whole row of these shops sort of sitting there empty. Really, they're the ones that haven't managed to find themselves, I guess, another persona as a shopping centre strip over time. So I know Bridge Road a couple of years ago was sitting at ridiculously high vacancy levels. They've managed somewhat to turn that around through sort of having more of a food kind of offering that sort of naturally occurred over time as apartments have gone up. So you've got sort of more and more cafes and restaurants opening in those precincts. But again, I think in the longer term, they're really going to struggle with vacancy levels, which can be quite, I guess, hard when you have got these all being individually owned. It can be quite tricky, I guess, then to really reach, because you haven't got that sort of one management aligned with the whole precinct. It can be very hard, I guess, to manage those vacancies and work out what you can do with the space, because you sort of, at the end of the day, sort of just got to appoint an agent to go around and try and lease a space for you, and there's kind of not an overall sort of plan for the overall precinct. And then finally, I'll just touch on large format retail. So large format retail centres used to be known as bulky goods centres, and these centres comprise sort of a more basic construction. Really, they're just sort of tilt slab constructed properties that look to cater to furniture, white goods, and sort of other homewares. These tenancies within these centres are generally quite large, and really they're there, I guess, for that purpose of displaying sort of like your showroom type, goods that are displayed in those kinds of tenancies. So, generally speaking, you'll get tenancies up to 5,000 square metres in size. Often these might be complemented by a Bunnings warehouse or something similar. I've got up on the screen there an example of Casey Lifestyle Centre, which is located in Narre Warren. This centre does really, really well, and it's one of the best performing large format retail centres in Victoria. And the reason for that really is because of its location right near Westwood Fountain Gate. And despite the fact that it's completely separate ownership, it's just been a really smart development because that owner has managed to, I guess, construct this asset over time and really understand, I guess, those basic fundamentals of location and how there can be flow-on effects, I guess, to you just based on where you're situated. The other thing about these centres is that generally they do really well being located in areas of high population growth. Because if you think about it, the people buying items such as furniture, homewares and that sort of thing, they're probably most likely to want to spend on those types of items when you've just purchased a new home or you're in the process of building a new home. So that's why those types of properties tend to do really well in those areas. These assets as well, I guess, vary from a planning perspective. As I touched on before, that shopping centres and where they're located can often be a function of the planning scheme. These types of assets as well tend to be located in commercial 2-zoned areas compared to your other centres which are generally located in commercial 1-zoned areas. So if you're ever looking at a site and the type of development that you might be able to put on those sites, really from a retail perspective there is quite a significant difference between what you can develop on commercial 1-zone land versus commercial 2-zone land. These centres as well don't tend to include one large major tenancy. They sort of more comprise of a whole lot of smaller tenancies rather than having just one sort of draw card tenant. So there's, I guess, some terms that I mentioned there that you might not all be familiar with. I think the biggest one to, I guess, be across when you're valuing a centre is how do you define what your space is in terms of a measurement. So gross lettable area is probably one of the most important terms that you can really know when you're undertaking a valuation, particularly for retail. So retail operates on what they call a gross area, compared to office, which operates on a net area. And really, there's just a subtlety in definition as to what is included sort of within the boundaries of your property in terms of the space that you can lease out to tenants. So GLA includes your storage and administration areas, but generally excludes separate storage and that sort of thing. As well, I guess, a slightly important thing to consider with retail is that you've got your sort of core shopping centre, and then often you've got a lot of little sundry properties to the side. They might be like a takeaway food or a standalone gym. Those assets are generally defined by gross lettable area, but the centre itself might be gross lettable area retail, which only measures to the front of the mall line of the shopping centre. It sounds like a silly comment, but it's actually really important for you to really know what space you're operating on in terms of undertaking a valuation of one of these centres, to know what space you're actually charging rent on back to tenants and what is sort of communal space that you can't actually gather any income from. Another term that you'll hear a lot about in retail is annual turnover. So annual turnover is what tenants report every year in terms of the sales that they generate out of their tenancy. So if I'm someone like Woolworths and I'm selling groceries, how much am I selling in groceries every year out of that one tenancy? So annual turnover becomes really important because it really shows how well your centre is actually operating once it's been completed. And once you've got customers coming into your centre, where are they spending their money? Are they spending it, maybe they're only spending their money in a certain type of spend, so maybe they're only going there to buy apparel, or maybe they're only going there to buy food. So in which case, you've just got to be really careful as to how you're targeting your tenancy mix, because you might find that you've got too much apparel within your centre and no one wants to go shopping there and no one wants to go buy that because all they want to do is go and buy food in that particular location. So annual turnover is really important because you can use it as a tool to really show where customers are spending their money and then try and isolate why that might be. So once we sort of put those two terms together, so you've got your gross lettable area that you can charge rent on, and again, your rent in retail is usually reflected as a gross rent. It could be a net rent deal, but it's usually reported as a gross market rent. And once you've got your turnover, that's when you can calculate what we call an occupancy cost ratio. Occupancy cost ratios are, again, a really important benchmark that we look at in retail, in the sense that it tells you whether or not the rental levels within your centre are sort of sustainable in the longer term. So I think before I use the example of perhaps apparel isn't doing so well in your centre, Urbis undertakes a detailed benchmarking study every year that we re-release, and it's used sort of as an industry standard. And this benchmark really talks about occupancy cost ratios as one of the key benchmarks that we measure, and we're probably the only firm that really measures it, which is why it has become sort of, I guess, the industry standard. The reason that this is so important is that if you have too many tenants within your centre that aren't performing well, but their rent has remained high, they will no longer be able to afford to pay that rent to you. So as an owner, you will no longer be able, I guess, to collect that rent from your tenant. That tenant might fall into debt and might not pay you their rent at all, and you might end up with a really large amount of arrears within your centre. So the reason that occupancy cost ratios are important is because it's essentially a percentage that can be benchmarked against other centres nationally. So essentially all the actual formula is, when you're looking at your own centre, is what is your gross rent per annum for that tenancy, and then what is that tenant generating in sales, and that will give you a percentage. I'll go through now, I guess, major tenant categories with you and talk about OCR levels as well. So some of these I touched on before. So department stores, I guess the three major brands that you may have heard of in this category is your Myer, your David Jones and your Harris Scarfe. Myer and David Jones, I guess, over the last few years, their performance has been very mixed. And generally, I think there's been quite a bit of ongoing debate about what the future will look like for them within Australia, and whether or not the market is big enough really to have two, essentially a duopoly between Myer and David Jones, and what that will look like in the future. Those two stores traditionally have had really, really large tenancies that can be sort of up to 3 or 4 levels, I guess, in size. So they can be anything up to like 13,000 square metres or more. They take up a hell of a lot of space in your shopping centre. So I guess the reason that it's become really important for us to consider what's going to happen with these tenancies is that in the future, if you have got one of those centres that you've got both of those tenants in your centre, all of a sudden, if one leaves, you might have 13,000 square metres of space that you need to find a replacement tenant for, which is a significant amount of space. If you think about an average specialty tenant might only be sort of between 80 and 150 square metres in size, and all of a sudden you've got to fill 13,000 square metres of space in one hit. That's a lot of space that you might have to fill. So I think what has been quite interesting is that the overall view about department stores has been quite pessimistic over the last 5 years, but really it has been interesting to see that probably not as many of these stores have closed as what people initially thought. But again, I think their OCR levels are looking like they're remaining pretty high, so they're not generating the level of sales that they really need to be able to afford to pay the rent in all of the shopping centres. So I think the consequences of that is that owners are kind of having to go into negotiations with these two tenants to really bring their rents back. So if their leases expire, sometimes the rent will go backwards as well, because to a certain extent, landlords do want to keep them in, even on a lower rent, just so they don't have to go through all that effort of reconfiguring those spaces. It's not always the case, though. I think some owners really look at it as being a potential opportunity for their centres. You know, they really want to be creating centres that are lively and dynamic, and people want to go and shop there. So sometimes by getting rid of one of these tenancies, it might actually do quite well for the centre. Harris Scarfe is an interesting one as well. I think over time they've sort of changed their identity a little bit. You know, in the early 2000s, Harris Scarfe was really like not looking too good at all. They were closing a lot of stores. They were really struggling to find their space compared to Myer and David Jones. Over time, though, they have sort of managed to sort of find their niche a little bit more and bounce back a little bit. And compared to David Jones and Myer, in some instances, they're actually performing better. Part of it is to do with their smaller tenancy size. So Harris Scarfe, generally speaking, so only operates in spaces of sort of 2,500 to 4,000 square metres, compared to the 13,000 square metres you've got for your Myer and your David Jones. I guess, so if you're looking at an overall benchmark for department stores, you really want your occupancy cost ratios to be sort of between 7 to 9%. So you want your rent to be only 7 to 9% of the turnover that they're generating in sales every year. We're finding that gross occupancy costs for those tenants have sort of crept up to 13%, and might even go higher. So I guess it will be really interesting to see what happens with those tenants going forward. A slight differentiation to department stores is your discount department stores. Hello. So discount department stores comprise of, I guess, the big brands are Kmart, Big W and Target. Again, probably not performing very well in the current market. Interestingly though, sort of in the last 12 to 24 months, Kmart have sort of rebounded quite a lot compared to where they were historically, and have really sort of become, I guess, the go-to discount department store compared to Big W and Target. I think as well, in terms of the service lines that these tenants are offering, they've sort of managed now to step a little bit into the space of department stores. So department stores have sort of been hit harder by the fact that discount department stores have sort of started to creep into their space a little bit. And it's partly to do with, I guess, their offering. So department stores historically were sort of more of your luxury items, and it was all revolved around service. I don't know if anyone frequently shops at Myer or David Jones, but you'll probably find now it can often be quite hard to get service, and often the level of items offered is probably not always, I guess, to the standard that it used to be. Comparatively, people used to go and shop at discount department stores knowing that they were going for a cheaper item and potentially didn't, expect the level of service. So I think, interestingly, because Myer and David Jones potentially stopped offering those services, potentially for a cost perspective, they've actually done themselves more harm than good. And people now just go, well, I'm not going to get the service at those stores anyway. The price here might be cheaper, but I'm actually not convinced that the quality is any less good, so I'm going to go and shop at somewhere like a discount department store. Moving on from department stores for a second, we've also, I guess, got supermarkets. So, we've had essentially that Woolworths Coles rivalry going on nationally for years and years. Interestingly, in this space, we're sort of finding that, particularly in New South Wales, there's sort of more, there's other entrants sort of entering that market that are sort of catered to a sort of more sort of gourmet grocery level of spend, I guess. So I guess the one thing I'm also missing off this slide is Aldi. Aldi is a bit of an interesting one. When Aldi entered the Australian market, they were very adamant that they didn't want to compete directly with Coles or Woolworths, and they wanted to always be located externally at a shopping centre. They didn't want to be located internally at a shopping centre at all, because they saw themselves as being completely independent. So at the time, this was quite, I guess, hard for centre owners to deal with, because they really wanted Aldi within their stores because of the service line that they offered, but they really struggled if they didn't have extra land lying about. It was really hard for them to go and construct a tenancy for Aldi to bring them in. What's actually occurred, I guess, over time is it's kind of been realised that Aldi can actually enhance a centre quite significantly if they're located internally within a shopping centre. Coles and Woolworths were also quite against Aldi being located internally within centres at the start as well. which is quite interesting because now if an Aldi is located within proximity to a Coles or a Woolworths, that Coles or Woolworths will generally actually do a little bit better than what they would have if the Aldi hadn't been there. So what tends to happen is you get people doing, I guess, cross-shopping between the stores, or they might go, because they've heard about an Aldi special buy, and they go, oh, I've got what I needed from Aldi. Oh, that's right, I also need stuff from Coles and Woolworths while I'm here. So it is interesting to see, I guess, how those dynamics between tenants change over time. Other major tenants that you might have within your shopping centre as well include, I guess, your cinemas. They're really important. It's interesting to see how they've also changed, I guess, over time as well. Now you've got cinemas looking sort of more going towards what used to be that smaller gold class level theatre service is now sort of expanded out, and you've got those larger cinema offerings that kind of have all those services that used to only go with gold class. So that's sort of done cinema as well, I guess, sort of over the past 5 years, because really for a little while there they'd sort of lost their identity a little bit. And then as well you might have other types of major tenants such as Bunnings. So they're often located, I guess, externally next to a centre, but again you get the benefits of sort of customers going between the centre and Bunnings to do their shopping. I've got, I guess, some definitions here about tenant categories that are really important to know. I guess really fundamentally a lot of it you come sort of drive back down to the area of your tenancy. So major tenancies generally, as I mentioned, they're your supermarkets, your discount department stores or your department stores. These generally have a lettable area over 1,000 square metres. What we then might determine to be a mini major is generally anything that's over an area of 400 square metres. Mini majors are interesting because they can actually perform really strongly within centres, and often they might have quite as much pull as a major tenant as well. So you get your JB Hi-Fi or your Dan Murphy's, those types of tenants, they perform really, really well, and they actually bring a lot of people into shopping centres. So in many ways they're considered sort of like an anchor tenant as well, even though I guess they take up less space within the centre. Mini majors are also interesting because you're getting new entrants into the market, such as international retailers. So we've seen the rise of H&M over the last few years, and it has been interesting to see that they haven't performed, I guess, to expectations. I think there was a little bit of buzz around H&M coming into the Australian market at the time, and generally they haven't quite performed as well. However, I guess an exception to that is you get other international retailers such as Uniqlo that are performing exceptionally well. So it is interesting to see how each, I guess, retailer has managed to adapt to this market. Mini majors can be useful as well, I guess, for those tenants that have got too much exposure to those department store categories. Mini majors are sort of your next backup option if something goes wrong and you lose one of your anchor tenants. You can always carve up that space and fill it with 2 mini major tenants, and you actually increase your rent because they're smaller tenancies, so those tenants will come in and actually pay a higher rent than what the large tenant was paying. And you actually sometimes end up with more foot traffic as well to your centre. So I think it's just important to consider that positioning your centre is really important, and really understanding what tenants you might need is important, and it isn't always about sort of having a shopping centre that just looks like, I guess, what a traditional shopping centre would have looked like. It's sort of more about catering that specifically to your local market. So specialty tenancies, they're your sort of non-major retail shops and are more specialised in what they offer. It's a very sort of narrow range of merchandise with an emphasis on product knowledge or customer service. These shops usually range up to 400 square metres, so they're smaller than your mini major tenants and your major tenants, but are still very important to your overall service offering at your centre. Separate to that, you might also have kiosks. Kiosks are, I guess, that space, they fill that space in your central mall areas. So within your shopping centre, often you'll have sort of empty space within the middle of your centre, and the best way to sort of combat that sort of feeling of empty space is to bring in kiosks. So these are small tenancies which are usually located in the centre of a mall, and they offer the smallest form, I guess, of offering, and they're usually non-permanent structures. So an example of this might be perhaps there's a sushi kiosk sort of in the middle of your centre near your food court, or you also get, I guess, mobile phone and communications types of tenants as well. They like to have sort of kiosk spaces as well. These break up the look and feel of a shopping centre as well, but they also have the added benefit of generating extra income, I guess, to the owner. But I will sort of caution that there is a fine line to how many kiosks you want within your shopping centre, and what can actually be supportable within your shopping centre. Because generally speaking, if you've got too many of them, then people don't tend to notice them and they just walk straight past. So there is definitely a fine line there. ATMs are interesting because with the sort of increase in PayWave and those types of services, ATMs are sort of becoming redundant in a way. Like they're not needed as much. So with that, there's been it sort of hit centre owners a little bit that had a lot of ATMs within their centres. They've had to realise that they're probably not going to have that many ATMs anymore, and they might only have 1 to 2 sort of ATMs within their centre, whereas potentially they used to have 30. In terms of the rent that ATMs provide to the centre, it's not that much. It might only be, well, I think now because they've come down, but historically they might have been up at sort of $20,000 per year in rent for an ATM. But I guess with the loss of the necessity for those services, I guess the rent has fallen as well. So now you might only be able to lease an ATM for sort of $5,000 to $10,000.
Sorry, just wondering, where does marketing fit? Is it, or advertising, I should say, does it fit into a tenant category, or does it?
Yes, interesting question. We tend to address that separately, only because I guess those types of licenses are often a little bit ad hoc. So the reason we include ATMs, I guess, as a tenant type within our centres is because generally it's sort of on a fixed lease. It's sort of like your 5 years sort of interval, and you know that they're going to be there for those 5 years, and maybe they've got the ability to stay for a longer period of time. With media and marketing contracts and that sort of thing, it is pretty consistent sort of between centres, and over time, I mean, it doesn't really disappear at all from the centre. But in terms of, like, I guess the tenure of that contract, it can vary quite significantly. So we tend to isolate just the income associated with those types of things and treat them separately, which I'll actually get to in a second. But yeah, it's a really good question. So I guess the last point I had there was about anchor tenants, and I guess it can be really easy to think of a major tenant as an anchor tenant, and for the most part it is. But sometimes you might have a mini major tenant that can be an anchor tenant, like I said before, because really it's just about who's drawing the customers into your centre, and it might not necessarily be the big tenants that we've all heard of. So I just thought I'd move on now, I guess, to shopping centre development and what's really important. And I know that everybody in their property studies will have addressed a lot of these attributes, so I won't dwell on them too much. But with shopping centres, I guess it's really important to understand your location. More so just for the level of sales that you can generate out of your shopping centre, and really catering to your local catchment. In terms of the physical site itself, it's always better for a shopping centre to be located on the outbound side of the road as opposed to the inbound side of the road. And the reason for that is because if you think about when people tend to do most of their shopping, it's usually in the evening or it's on the weekend. So if people are in a hurry to get to work and they're driving inbound, they're probably going to less likely to stop to pick up their groceries. So particularly for those neighbourhood centres, it's really important that you're located on a main arterial road that's sort of on the outbound side of the road. Orientation of the shopping centre as well is really important. So how does the shopping centre sit in relation to the rest of the site? what are the street frontages like? How many main roads access that site? I guess the shopping centres that perform really strongly are the ones that have main arterial roads on more than one side. And really, I mean, it's logical. It's like if you're driving down the road and all of a sudden you see a shopping centre, you go, oh, I'll just go there. But if you have to try and find out how to get into the car park and it's not accessible, then it can be quite tricky and people aren't likely to want to shop there as much. So that's why access to the site is really important. Sort of to do with access as well is really car parking, and car parking is really, really important. So every time that we're doing a shopping centre valuation, we do a site inspection, and as part of that process we actually go and look at the car park. And I know that sounds really silly, but it's actually really important because particularly for your smaller scale centres where you've got supermarkets, it's really important that customers can get their groceries from the shopping centre to their car really easily without having to deal with uneven car parks or sloping sites and that sort of thing. Shopping centre development over time has changed in that regard. So there are a few shopping centres that still remain in Melbourne where they didn't really consider car parking very much at all. And it was all sort of just about just building a centre quickly and as easily as possible and not really thinking about those sort of next level things. So an example of that is Brandon Park Shopping Centre near Glen Waverley. So that centre was built in an old quarry site and they didn't really bother to level the site properly at all. So when you're walking around even the inside of the centre, the malls are actually sloped. So we're all probably used to going to a shopping centre and just sort of walking on a flat floor. In some of those older centres, they didn't really do that, and they just built to the conditions. So they'd have a supermarket, and then they'd have a car park. But in order to get your trolley to your car, you had to go up or down an embankment, which is just silly. And who can really be bothered doing that when there might be another supermarket down the road where you haven't got that problem? On the topic of car parking as well, it's really important to understand how many car spaces you have compared to the total area of your centre. As centres get bigger, it's only sort of natural that the requirement to have more car parking occurs because you've got more and more people accessing those centres, so therefore you need more car parks. Which sounds, again, like a really basic principle, but again is really important because if you don't do that, customers give up pretty easily if they can't get a car space, particularly if it's Christmas time. So I guess the next thing that we really look at is competition. Competition, as I alluded to earlier, can be sort of internal to your own centre, or it can be based on the centres around you. What we do at Urbis is we look externally at competition, and what we do is we map all of the centres around our centre to really understand where those centres sit in relation to our centre and where customers might be coming from or where else they might be going if we're not offering or if the centre that we're looking at isn't offering the best service to really capture them. Competition as well. Generally speaking, your centre will comprise a certain tenancy mix. So the best tenancy mixes are the ones that really service the catchment. So it's really important to look at the types of people living within your area around your centre to understand really basic things such as how old they are, have they been living in the suburb for very long, have they got established businesses within the area that potentially you can integrate within your shopping centre? Why are they going to your centre? Are they just going there to do their grocery shop, or do they really want to have a place to hang out with their friends and go and see a movie? The other thing to look at, I guess, as terrible as it sounds, is that we need to consider how much money people are earning within a catchment around a shopping centre, because this will affect the type of tenancy mix that you create within your centre. So typically speaking, areas where I guess there's sort of less income coming into people's households, they generally do not have as much money to spend on leisure items. So the types of centres that are best suited to those types of areas are ones that offer your sort of more convenience-based food offering or your retail services offering. So it's probably generally going to be your sort of neighbourhood centre or your smaller sub-regional centre. In areas that I guess are more affluent, potentially you need to create a tenancy mix that's more built around leisure items or apparel. Because these are the items that are considered to be not a necessity and are therefore considered, I guess, to be discretionary items. And as well, your regional centres are pulling, I guess, a catchment from further away. So I know, like in Melbourne, regardless of sort of which suburb you live in on the eastern side of Melbourne, you're most likely to go to Chadstone at least once or twice a year. And if you live closer to it, I guess you're going to go more frequently. But those types of centres can afford to have more of their tenants aligned with sort of leisure items. Because they're drawing, I guess, from a larger catchment, so they're more likely to capture people with a little bit of extra money to spend here and there as well. The other reason why competition is important is because it can really affect, I guess, the level of rent that you can charge your tenants. So if you've got a whole lot of shopping centres all opening up in one particular area, you've got too much competition going on for your centre itself, and you might be able to actually lease all the space within your centre. So if you're looking at a new development, it's really important to be strategic about where you place the site and take that into consideration. It's not just about, I guess, building the biggest shopping centre and the best shopping centre, it's building the shopping centre that's right for that location. So sometimes you might find maybe the best thing to build is just a supermarket. Maybe you don't even need the specialty stores that go with it because maybe they're not actually going to offer anything else to you, and it's just really just another thing that you have to build and then manage over time. And I guess part of understanding your local trade area is to really understand where there's market gaps and niches. So I know some of the centres that we look at, they have a really particular type of demographic that like to potentially buy certain types of food. And maybe you need to understand, I guess, what type of money people want to spend within your catchment in order to deliver, I guess, the best tenancy mix for them. It's really important as well to understand the size of your trade area population. So for your smaller centres, like your neighbourhood centres, really customers are only going to be coming to your centre from sort of a 5 to 10 kilometre radius. So your population size is generally speaking going to be a little bit smaller. For your regional centres, as I said before, you're sort of drawing in customers from a larger area and therefore you've got a larger trade area population. Market growth prospects, as I said before, sort of ties back into your competition. So if you've got a lot of centres around your centre that are sort of stealing away some of your customers, you're probably going to have slightly lower growth prospects within your cash flow. However, in areas where there's really high population growth, sometimes you can support a lot of centres, but it's more that the growth might only be limited, I guess, compared to if they weren't there. So some of these points here I've already touched on. Pedestrian traffic flow, I think, is really important to understand. Is how are individuals accessing your site, as I said before, but also once they're within the centre, how are they choosing to move around the space? And this is partly to do with how centres are designed as well. So part of the reason that anchor tenants are called anchor tenants is because they draw customers into the centre. So the best way, I guess, to orientate your centre is to have anchor tenants at either end of the centre or along one side of the centre so that customers are forced to walk past. In order to go where they want to go, they're forced to walk past all of the smaller tenants, and then they're more likely to stop and spend money at other shops as well along the way. Shop front exposure is also really important. It's really important for tenants to have really nice access to the internal mall areas so that they can be seen and so that they can have the relevant signage that they need to advertise their business. Shopfront exposure can be from like the width of the tenancy sort of onto the internal mall areas, but it can also be the height of the what they call the bulkhead at the top of your shop, where you display your signage. So if your signs are down too low, you actually cut off a lot of the visible space within inside your tenancy. So it's actually harder for you to advertise, I guess, what you're selling within your tenancy. Whereas if the bulkheads are up higher, it improves people's ability to be able to see your store, I guess, from further away and go, oh, there's a store that sells flowers. I really need to go and buy some flowers. I'll go over there because I can see them from far away. Similarly, it's really important to have a clear sight line towards your major tenants. So if your mall is oddly shaped, it can really impact on your ability for customers to really see where they're going. And once you start to rely too heavily on internal signage, it kind of really starts to show you that you've probably got a problem with your internal sight lines within your centre. Signs, I guess, are good for assisting customers, but if you've got too many of them, it can be way too confusing. So really, I guess at the end of the day, the best thing to understand is the width of the malls and the ability for customers to be able to see where they want to go. I think I've touched on most of these already. The one I would point out and highlight is turnover or sales thresholds. So turnover or sales thresholds are really important because your turnover can impact on the level of rent that you pay. So this is often a function of the lease structure. So specialty tenant leases typically have a certain percentage within their lease that they pay as what they call a percentage rent or a turnover rent. And it's on what they call a natural threshold level. So just say that percentage for a specialty tenant might be anywhere between 8 to 10%. And all that it generally is, it will take the first year of net income within your lease and divide that by 8%. And that will give you your threshold. And that threshold is the level of sales that if you hit that threshold, you then have to pay an additional rent on top of your normal everyday rent. This is another reason why really understanding your catchment becomes really important, is because it can actually impact upon the level of rent that you're receiving from your tenants. Because they might come in and agree to pay $100,000 a year to lease the space, but then they're also going to pay you more rent. If they can perform well within that tenancy, they will pay you more rent on top of that as well. And again, this becomes really important within your valuation, because any additional income that you can derive out of your centre will only impact you positively from a valuation perspective. If you think about how a cash flow model works, any extra income you can derive out of your centre is really important. And similarly, any expense that you can reduce will also lead you to be in a better net income position. I think I've touched on most of those ones there. But I guess really this is the process that we walk through every time we do evaluation. Is the first thing is we look at the site attributes. Where are our competitors located within this trade area that's going to impact upon the shopping centre that we're looking at? How far does that trade area actually extend from the centre? Is it 5 kilometres? Is it 10 kilometres? Is it a radius, or maybe it's sort of more skewed based on landmarks? Maybe you've got mountains in the way, so it cuts off your particular catchment in a certain direction. Or maybe you've got train lines or freeways blocking customers' access to your site as well. So it's something else that's really important to consider. We then have to look at population and the level that that's likely to grow over time. What does your population look like in terms of who's it made up of? What sort of ages are we looking at? Is it family groups? Is it singles? Is it couples? Who's living in the area that surrounds your centre? And what are they interested in spending their money on? And I guess finally, once you've understood all of those components, that's when you can really understand what level of sales you're going to be able to generate out of your shopping centre. So on that basis, I think one of the best things that we have access to in Australia is the census data. And this is really useful for looking at historic performance of a particular area over time. So here, this delves into population of Manningham Council area in eastern Melbourne and looks at the growth historically over time from the year 2006 to the year 2016 based on census years. So you'll see that on average per annum in those timeframes, population growth was significantly below that of Greater Melbourne. In order for shopping centre owners to really understand how their centres will perform, they actually need to look forward. And so this is where, I guess, understanding the broader economy becomes really important to understanding how your shopping centre will perform over time. Population growth alone isn't the one factor that will help a shopping centre grow, but it is probably one of the most important ones. Because if your population is increasing exponentially, you have so much more customers that you can potentially capture into your centre. And that can only really fare well for tenants operating within the centre because they have the ability to generate more sales, and then, as I said before, there might be potential flow-on effects back to you as the centre owner. Other things that we need to look at, though, is maybe if the population isn't growing well in the area, are people in that area getting wealthier? Because if they are, maybe that's another way you can derive growth out of your centre. Again, census data can be a really useful tool in understanding the income levels of individuals around your centre. So this is an example of Stockland the Pines in Templestowe. And you can see there that the areas in orange are areas that are pretty affluent areas. So they've got income levels generally 20% greater than the Melbourne average per capita income. Whereas the areas in purple are sort of the areas where there's less wealthy individuals that might not have quite as much money to spend. So again, that's a really important thing to consider when you're looking at your shopping centre, is where is the spend coming from? And how can you cater your centre to potentially a mixed demographic? So this centre, towards the north and east of the centre, you've got areas that are relatively affluent, whereas areas to the south, west of the centre are slightly less affluent. But that doesn't mean that only one type of person is going to shop at your centre. They're probably both going to shop at your centre. So what are you offering individuals in both of those, I guess, both of those sort of areas? What can you offer them, I guess, that will really drive growth within your own centre? So this is just an example of how you might pull together a schedule outlining your trade area. So you can look at it on a local government area basis or on a radius basis. And again, I think census data is really, really useful in this regard, particularly given that, 2016 is a few years ago now, but every time they publish census data, you'll notice that people that are interested in shopping centres will really keep a close eye on this data to just see how it's moved over time. So the other thing that's really important to understand is where those other centres that are competing against your centre are located. So this map here just maps out centres from a supermarket centre level, a neighbourhood centre level, up to a regional centre level, and then shows the types of major tenants within each of those centres as well. So if we were looking at the one in the middle, which is Stockland the Pines, we can see that it's got a Kmart, and we can also see that the closest Kmart to our centre is in Eastland, I would think. Looks good, yes. Just. So I guess it's really important to understand, where those other tenants are located and what's competing against them as well from a tenant perspective. Really detailed economic analysis can also be undertaken on shopping centres, and this is where specialist firms will come in and define what they're called a trade area catchment. These studies that can be done on shopping centres are really interesting. And over time, they've only gotten better. 10 years ago, you would be looking at going to your shopping centre and sitting there with a pen and paper and taking exit surveys of anybody that walked in and out of the shopping centre and saying, oh, hello, where do you live? How far have you come shopping here today? What did you spend your money on? Over time, I guess, as data has become more readily available, it is easier for owners to really understand where people are coming to shop at their shopping centre. And there's a few ways that they're gathering this information. Probably the most interesting one is the use of credit card data. So it is interesting, I guess, from a privacy perspective. Some people have been a little bit uncomfortable knowing that some of their credit card data might be being used for this sort of purpose. But this is where the likes of Quantium and those type of companies really look and delve into data to really create and understand, I guess, what's actually going on in economies on a more micro level. So credit card data can be really useful because it can show you where people are coming from to spend money at your centre, and then once they're at your centre, how many transactions are they making and which stores are they going to. And this has been really enlightening for owners because they can look at a centre and go, oh wow, I didn't understand that people that were coming to go to the gym were also buying groceries at the same time. And this is actually starting to lend itself to changes in how owners are actually operating their shopping centres. I'll touch on this a little bit later, I guess, in the presentation. But over time, we're finding that medical centre and other complementary uses are becoming more integrated with shopping centres. And part of that can be has sort of come about as we've sort of begun to understand more about people's shopping habits. On that basis as well, you can really start to understand the frequency of where shoppers are coming from. So your primary, what they might call your primary catchment, is where is your centre trading relatively unopposed and where are people sort of always coming from to shop at your centre. You then might break that down further into secondary or even tertiary areas, and that really shows you people that probably come and shop at your centre occasionally, but maybe it's only once a week compared to the other people that might shop at your centre, more than a couple of times a week. This centre here, this was undertaken for a sort of neighbourhood-sized shopping centre. Over time, I guess it'll be interesting to see how this particular catchment might change because you might get potentially more people living within some of these areas over time, particularly as housing densities continue to increase along major train lines. And the other thing is, if you were to look at the catchment of this other centre, Eastland, sitting here to the southwest of this centre, you would find that Eastland's catchment goes all the way across the catchment of this centre. I guess what's really important though is that the fact that these two centres would be catering to a slightly different spend. So Eastland would be looking to capture customers that would be looking to spend items on luxury items or the like, whereas this centre in Croydon would probably be more looking to draw in customers for their weekly grocery spend. So once you understand, I guess, all the fundamentals that come with, I guess, the physical attributes of the site and your local catchment, that's when you can really start to delve more into the valuation of the centre. So within this, I'll try and touch on, I guess, some broader valuation methodologies, understanding the components of valuation and what we look at, and I guess also just explaining why we even undertake these valuations to begin with. Does anyone have any questions before I move on? Okay. So I guess hopefully most of you are familiar with these forms of valuation. I will try to explain them as much as I can in the time frame, but obviously really it's just practice undertaking a lot of these valuation methods. So what we use in retail to value a shopping centre is the capitalisation of net income approach, and we also use a secondary method known as the discounted cash flow approach. So I guess reliance is typically given towards the capitalisation of net income approach, and the reason for this is that regardless of the size of your centre, this is sort of tends to be how purchasers might look at buying a centre is really based on this approach. Discounted cash flows are sort of more important for your larger scale centres, such as your regional or sub-regional centres, and maybe your larger neighbourhood centres, where it's probably less used for your smaller neighbourhood centres. So the capitalisation net income approach looks at all the income that you are deriving out of your shopping centre and then nets out any expenses. It then applies what we call a capitalisation rate to your net income to derive a value. The future risk and return assumptions are embedded within that capitalisation rate. So if you've got a softer capitalisation rate, and by that I mean a higher percentage, it usually indicates that there's more risk associated with that centre. If you've got a lower cap rate, so a lower percentage, it's usually telling you that it's a pretty safe asset and it's probably more of like a passive type of investment, or maybe it's got some underlying fundamentals that make it really good. So maybe it's got potential for future site intensification and you might be able to develop mixed use on the site in the future. So from a softer metrics point of view, you've probably really got to look to reposition your centre in order to get it to performing well, because maybe you want a higher return for that centre at the moment because it's a little bit risky. Maybe you've got a lot of vacancy within your centre. Maybe it's within a trade area that hasn't got a lot of population growth and isn't forecast to be able to achieve growth in any other ways as well. The discounted cash flow approach is sort of more of looks more over time, and really this becomes a really detailed modelling exercise, particularly for your larger shopping centres where you've got hundreds of tenants. You have to model each tenant over your investment horizon, and we undertake that on a month-to-month basis for every tenant. So by the time you've got 300 tenants within a centre, we model out to a 15-year timeline. You end up obviously with a lot of numbers in your spreadsheet. So I guess the most important thing to really understand in your discounted cash flow approach is where different items are coming in and at what point in time. Another approach that we sometimes use, which is mainly for the smaller scale assets, is the direct comparison approach. And usually this is just on a rate per square metre of the centre area. So you might look at what a neighbourhood centre sold for, and its overall quantum, and look at the size of the centre and work out what that would be on a rate per square metre. So I just might walk us through, I guess, the capitalisation approach and also touch on the DCF approach as well. So it's really important, I guess, to understand your net income position for your shopping centre. And the reason why this is really important is because you've got different tenants within your centre operating under different leases. So they've all got their own contract signed with the owner of the centre, and they might actually be paying different things based on what's written in their lease. So understanding your net income position is really important because it's built up of every tenant's income that they're paying back to the centre owner, and then the centre owner then has to really understand what their expenses are for running the centre so that you can get back to a net income position that's actually reflective of what is actually going on and what actually shows, I guess, what is sustainable. There's no point having a whole lot of tenants in the centre but you're not actually delivering any services to them or offering them significant, I guess, repairs to things that might break. And if they're not spending that money it might inflate your net income in the short term, but in the longer term, it might actually decrease it because you might get a whole lot of tenants say, I've had enough, and they might walk out and they might leave. So again, it's really about understanding what makes sense from a balancing point of view between really generating value out of your tenants, but also providing for them as well. So with your rental income, you can have different types of rent that tenants might pay, and this depends on their lease. So often in retail, it's generally a net lease. So you pay an agreed base rent over the area of your tenancy, and then you also pay a contribution separately back to the owner of the centre, which is for any operating expenses or outgoings associated with the owner running the centre. So your rent will generally be paid by each tenant every month. And when a lease starts is really just dependent on whether or not there is a shop for lease and the timing of that. So you might find that your lease commencements from your tenants can vary very significantly, whereas your outgoings will generally only be on a financial year or a calendar year basis. So it's also something that you really need to consider with your cash flows when we get to the DCF. You might also have tenants in the centre paying a gross rent. Essentially all this means is they just pay their rent per month, and they don't pay anything on top of that back to the owner.
When you're looking at rental income and you're valuing,
Yeah.
how, I'm guessing like leases, etc., can be quite complex.
Yeah.
So for an existing centre, are you having to rely on someone going through every single one of those leases and kind of giving you the general bottom line?
It really depends on what the valuation is being used for. So for, I guess, a financial reporting valuation for a large owner, that they might report a book value every year or every half year, or even in some instances every quarter. It isn't always integral to view every single lease document. But I guess any prudent valuer would really have to understand, I guess, these broader concepts really well. And sort of over time, you start to sort of see that different types of tenants will generally have a pretty standard lease that they just roll out across every one of their shops. That's not always the case, but you do start to see patterns in things. Really, all that you can do in that situation is just really disclaim that your valuation, sourcing the information that you have relied on, and often that is provided by the centre management entity or maybe the centre owner. And that's all you can do. So usually, as a rule of thumb, we try and audit at least 10% of the leases within a shopping centre for those really big ones. But if you think about it, when you've got 300 tenants, 10% is actually a lot of leases to review. So for your smaller centres, we'll try and review every lease if we can. So if it's like a little neighbourhood shopping centre, we'll read the Woolworths or the Coles lease back to front, probably numerous times, because they can be quite tricky. And then also try and read the leases for every specialty tenant if we can. So I guess, aside from lease reading, the other way that you can sort of understand what rent your tenants are paying is by looking at a tenancy schedule. So a centre owner or manager that runs their centre well, they'll have a really accurate tenancy schedule. And within that, they essentially list the key components that are contained within the lease. And in that will detail, is it a net lease, or is it a gross lease, or is it a semi-gross lease? The reason it becomes extra important to understand what your tenants are paying to you is because it matters what expenses you're then, I guess, deducting back out of your income. So if you have a tenant that's paying $100,000 a year gross, but then you've got another tenant paying $80,000 a year net plus $20,000 in outgoings, it ends up being the same gross rent. But in terms of how that gets treated in the valuation, it can vary. So it's just something to be aware of, I guess, is really understanding if you have got net rents, what outgoings are being added back on top of that to get up to that $100,000. And understanding, I guess, what is included in that. I guess for specialty tenants, it's just, I guess, a rule of thumb to remember is probably that they're probably not going to be able to recover land tax from a specialty tenant. Under Retail Leases Act legislation, that legislation aims to essentially protect smaller business operators and tenants within shopping centres. So land tax can be quite a burden on shopping centre owners. Given it's assessed on the land value of the shopping centre, councils or state government, the weighting of values often gets pushed quite heavily onto retail. So often the expense that comes with that land tax notice goes back to the landowner, and they can't actually then on-charge it back to a tenant. So that's another reason why it's really important to understand what outgoings you're actually receiving back from your tenants, because if you're not receiving land tax, that means you've got more out-of-pocket expense that will impact your bottom line. I didn't quite touch on the last one. So semi-gross outgoings is where you might pay a rent and then pay outgoings on top of your rent, but only for certain items. So along with, I guess, the income associated with each of your tenants, you might also have income on top of that. So turnover rent, as I mentioned before, is a really important one, particularly, it's only really sort of seen in retail compared to your other asset classes. And this is just a rent that's paid based on a tenant achieving a certain level of turnover, and that's contributed in addition to their other rent that they're already paying. Tenants might also contribute a storage rent. This is where they essentially pay an additional fee to lease some additional storage space within the centre. This isn't really treated within your tenancy schedule. This is usually addressed separately. So this is up sort of in what they might call other income. And really that allowance is just an annual allowance that gets capitalised at your core centre rate. And it's an add-on on top of the income you're receiving from your tenants to being within their tenancies. Signage rent is another one. Again, it's a marketing allowance that I think we were talking about before. So media companies will come in and pay to advertise within shopping centres, and you might have seen those scrolling advertising boards within shopping centres. Usually an advertising agency will come in and pay for that space, and then they will choose what advertising they want to put on that board. And those advertising agencies essentially pay the centre owner to use that space. Again, that's another form of income that's not necessarily associated with a particular tenancy and is sort of treated within your core income separately. Casual mall leasing is another interesting one, and this can be really tricky to understand when you're walking around a shopping centre, to understand what is casual mall leasing and what is a kiosk that's there on a fixed lease. Generally speaking, you can tell by looking at, I guess, how permanent the structure looks. So with casual mall leasing, you might get someone coming in to sell raffle tickets for a car raffle. That's probably an example of casual mall leasing. You might get your local sports team spruiking a raffle as well. That's probably another example of casual mall leasing. You might also get tenants that want to test the market a little bit and potentially don't want to commit to a full long lease within the centre. That can be considered a form of casual leasing or pop-up mall leasing. This is a really useful way for centre owners to really manage vacancy risk as well. So if you've had a whole lot of tenants come up for expiry at the same time, you might find all of a sudden you've got a bit too much vacancy within your centre and you're struggling to lease all that space. However, you might find that you might be able to entice some people into the centre just for a short period of time, and they will pay a rent in order to do that as well. The really important thing to understand, though, with casual mall leasing is to not double count your income that can be associated with that. So if you're looking at your valuation model, if you've got a market rent applied to a vacant tenancy, don't also apply a rent for a tenant coming in to lease that space on a pop-up basis, because in many regards you're sort of double dipping from a market rent perspective. It's fine to have casual mall leasing as well as vacant shop income, but your casual mall leasing, I guess, you would just want to try and isolate that to the areas sort of within your central mall area that's not being used for anything else. Telecommunication towers is also another big form of income, and so is vending machines and kids' rides within centres as well. Just another one that I haven't included on that slide, but I think is really important, is that centre owners can install what they call an embedded network within shopping centres. And what an embedded network is it's a way for shopping centre owners to manage electricity to their tenancies within the centre. Embedded networks are interesting because they are changing rapidly over time. So the more traditional form of embedded network was when, rather than every individual tenancy being fitted with a separate meter to charge electricity back to the grid and then pay a separate electricity retailer, a centre manager would come in and say, I'm going to manage electricity for everybody here. However, in doing that, I'm going to take on the role of being an electricity retailer. So I will go and source wholesale electricity externally and bring it to the centre, and I will then provide you with that electricity, but then on-charge it to you. I guess the interesting thing about electricity income is that over time it's become more and more included within centres, and now it's very rare for me to see a shopping centre that hasn't got electricity income associated with it. Generally speaking, it's still not really seen in your smaller centres, so your neighbourhood centres, but in your sort of larger neighbourhood centres up to your regional centres, it's definitely something that you would expect to see. It can actually work out favourably for tenants as well. I know shopping centre owners can often be sort of seen as, I guess, being a little bit greedy because maybe they're charging rents that are too high and the tenants kind of want to pay the rent and they and that sort of thing. But I think the interesting thing about electricity income is that the owner can actually provide electricity at cheaper prices back to tenants than what they might be able to get if they went back into the general electricity market. So that's another form of income that you would actually include in your valuation. So if you're actually deriving an income from selling electricity back to your tenants, you would include that within your valuation, but you would just apply a different risk premium to that type of income. So within your cap approach, rather than capitalising that at your core income level, you'd probably capitalise it at a softer rate. Again, it's really important to understand your outgoings. So outgoings expenses can be essentially anything involved with running your shopping centre. So they can be day-to-day repairs and maintenance of items within your centre. It can be the cost of cleaning the centre. It can be the cost of providing services to the food court, repairing lifts, repairing escalators, managing pests within the centre, making sure it's a clean environment. So that's what you would kind of hear as your variable outgoings. And then your statutory outgoings essentially are expenses on the essentially charged to the centre owner from a state or federal government level. So these are extra expenses that you might have to pay, like I mentioned before, land tax, council rates, and water and drainage rates. On top of those more common allowances, within retail there's also extensive management fees and costs that centre owners incur. In retail, your management entity is really important because they manage the day-to-day operation of the shopping centre. They lease spaces in the centre. They make sure that the centre is operating efficiently. And they often have an on-site office as well. So if anything goes wrong at the centre, they can go and attend to that matter or get security involved in attending to a matter. So obviously the cost of having all of those services on site can be really expensive. So management expenses can be really expensive as well. And as a general rule of thumb, it can comprise from sort of 5% of your income up to, I think I've seen 10% of income for management expenses. So it is pretty expensive, and it is a large component of running a shopping centre efficiently. So this is kind of what your standard schedule of outgoings might look like, and you can see all the categories there for all your centres. We always look at it on a rate per square metre. So if you're ever looking at a centre, look at, I guess, the overall expense you might have to pay, and then work out what that would be apportioned over your whole centre. That way you can also fairly charge your expenses back to your tenants, because you can go to your tenants and say, expenses are $100 $199.78 a metre. This is the area of your tenancy. This is what the cost is on a rate per square metre, so this is how much I'm going to charge you every year. The only thing I would allude to is, again, check your leases and make sure that you're not charging tenants for items that you can't actually charge them for. For this centre I've got on the screen, you'll notice that we made some changes. So we felt like they were probably spending a little bit too much money trying to manage their centre for what they're actually getting out of it. So we thought that those expenses were too high, so we brought them back. So you can change, if you're ever valuing a centre, it's more than reasonable and is expected of you to look at your outgoings expenses and actually see if they're reasonable and adjust them accordingly. So this is just the tenancy schedule and what it would typically look like. So you've got your tenants there, the type of tenant that they are, how much space do they comprise within the centre, what's their lease term, have they got option periods available to them once they go past their current lease term, and how is their rent reviewed every year. This is really important for your cash flow. You'll notice that most of the specialty tenants down the bottom have fixed increases every year. So every year, at the anniversary of the commencement of their lease, their rent will go up 5% per annum, or their rent will go up 4% per annum. And again, the timing of that will depend on the individual tenant lease. So every day of the year, you might find you've got rent changing for one of the tenants within your centre. So again, that's something to be aware of, is that your income moves over time. So once you know what your base rents are, that's when you might have your recoveries added in on top there to get you to a gross passing rent position. Once you know what your gross passing rent is, it's really then important to consider, are the rental levels at market? And to look at them, I guess, on a rate per square metre and adjust them if you need to. And before I spoke about occupancy cost ratios, so at this centre you'll see that the subject centre has OCR levels at about 18.8% and the benchmark is only 14%. So what does that tell us about the rent, do you think, within this centre for most tenants? It's too high, yeah. So it's important to bring the rents back, I guess, in line with where they should be. So on that basis, the best way to set out your tenancy schedule and your valuation is really to isolate what your gross passing rent is, say what market rent you've adopted, and then show that variance per annum. Then take that variance and apply what we call a rental reversion, which is adjusted for timing. So usually just look at it on a month basis. So if they've got, I think Proud's in this example only had 1 month remaining, so that roughly works out to be $865 variance in that you apply to your cap approach. I've got the calculations there if you want to go through in your own time and have a look as to how you might do that. But essentially all the tenants within this centre, we felt like their rents were too high, so we brought them back. I think I've addressed most of these items. So this essentially is what you'll end up with if you undertake your cap approach. So you're building up on your base rent plus your outgoings recoveries from your tenants, plus any percentage rent or turnover rent that they might pay, and then deducting out your total outgoings to look back at your net income position. That's then where you apply your capitalisation rate. So the best way to come up with a capitalisation rate is to look at recent sales and see how your centre compares. Once you've done that, you end up with your what they call your core capital value. So that's what's your centre worth, provided that you didn't have to do anything else to the centre. Like you didn't have to lease up any vacant space, or you didn't have to adjust for any other items such as electricity income or capital expenditure. And once you know that, that's where you can then deduct off those rental reversions that I was talking about before. So in this centre, we've capitalised a market rent and then added in the shortfall, the over and above allowance that the passing is providing to bring us back to, I guess, a fair value for the centre given those contracted lease terms. It's really then important to deduct any additional expenses you might have with leasing up vacant tenancies or with any other major upgrades to the centre that you might need to implement. So capital expenditure really is out of pocket to the centre owner and you can't recover that from your tenants. That's just saying, what do I need to spend on my centre in order to keep it looking good and running effectively above anything that's repairs and maintenance. So perhaps that is painting, repainting the whole external portion of the centre, installing a new food court, bringing in new furniture, those sorts of items. So with your cash flow, I guess it's really important to understand what your tenants are paying from day one, so your date of valuation or your date of sale, and then projecting that forward over the cash flow. So that's where your fixed rental increases become really important. And what sort of growth are you applying to your sales? If your supermarkets are generating $40 million in sales a year, how much are they going to grow over into the future? Because that will affect their percentage rent if they're paying any as well. And then, are tenants likely to renew within the centre? That's another really important consideration. It's really, I guess, a good way to look at your cash flow is to really consider how likely tenants are to renew, and then apply a sort of probability formula to work out what incentives or downtime allowances you would apply. So I've just got an example there. For new leases, you might find you've got to pay out an average 9-month incentive, and maybe for renewing leases, you've only got to pay 3 months. So if only 75% of tenants are renewing, you're going to end up pulling 5.25 months of gross rent per tenant through your cash flow as an incentive allowance. I think I've touched on most of those items. Yeah, I think so. So essentially you end up with your cash flow. And it's really important to separate out your different tenant types because they've all got different growth profiles over time. And again, looking at your percentage rent is really important as well. So you'll see at this centre we had a major tenant producing percentage rent every year for the first, sort of forecast for the first 8 years of the cash flow, and then after that point in time it was predicted that it probably would drop out a little bit towards the end of the cash flow. Sundry income that I've got marked there within the income, that's the other income I was talking about earlier, so that might be casual mall leasing, storage, vending machines, that sort of income. And then deducting out all of your expenses associated with running your centre in order to get back to a net income position. And that's then when you can perform your NPV analysis there. The other really important thing about your DCF is understanding your terminal year. And this is why your projections about your income and your outgoings become really important. Because you need to understand roughly what your centre is likely to sell for in year 10 of your cash flow. So if your growth rates are, I guess, not accurate, then you might end up with a very different value in year 10, which can really impact on the value of your centre once you undertake your present value analysis of your terminal value. As a rule of thumb in retail, if you have a cap rate of 6%, at the date of valuation, it's probably going to soften by 25 basis points in your terminal year. So that's a general rule of thumb that you typically apply to commercial or retail, is something that's 6% now will probably be 6.25 in 10 years. I know I've spoken through that quite quickly, but I am a little bit conscious of time. So I guess really understanding what discount rate and cap rate you apply to your centre is really dependent on your sales analysis. So understanding other centres that have sold and what they sold for and why is really important. Who bought the centre and what was their intention for that centre? Were they looking to redevelop that centre in the future, or was it more of a passive income stream that they were looking at? Was the sale considered to be an arm's length transaction, or were the purchaser and vendor known to each other and really it was not arm's length at all, and it was on potentially not market terms? This is just an example of a centre that sold in November last year. This is a little neighbourhood centre in Epping in Victoria, and this is the type of analysis that we would undertake for the centre. And really, if you're undertaking a sales analysis, it's just a reverse calculation of what you would do if you were trying to do a valuation, because you know what the property sold for, you know what the centre income was. So if you just divide your centre income by your sale price, you can effectively end up in a position where you understand what the yield is. We also undertake a DCF analysis for our sales as well. That's really important to understand where your discount rate is likely to fall, I guess by looking at your IRR as well. Generally speaking, IRRs that are higher generally have more protected income growth in the cash flow versus a lower IRR. So you'll see that this IRR was 6.26% on this centre, which is considered